Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our briefing, Methane Mitigation on the Global Stage. I'm Dan Brissett. I'm the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. This is the second installment in our briefing series about what Congress needs to know about COP29. EESI is celebrating 40 years of congressional education in advancing climate change solutions. We were founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and since 1984, we've worked to provide science-based information about environmental, energy, and climate change topics to policymakers and the public. We do our best to ensure that our briefings and other resources are timely, relevant, accessible, and practical. We put a lot of thought into them so that they're ready for congressional staff and other stakeholders need them. Our briefings like this, sometimes they're online, sometimes they're in person on Capitol Hill. We do a lot of other stuff too. We cover a lot of topics like the budget and appropriations process, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and Inflation Reduction Act, and the progress of rolling out those different programs and investments, carbon dioxide removal, dam removal, nature-based solutions, river community resilience, and so much more. Everything is always available for free online at www.eesi.org. And to keep up with everything we're doing, I definitely recommend you subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. It's a great way to stay in the loop. And since we're talking about COP and the UNFCCC today, there's no better resource to keep up to date with what's happening over in Azerbaijan than subscribing to our daily newsletter, COP Dispatch. We are about to get into a very deep discussion of methane emissions and mitigation strategies relevant to the upcoming Conference of Parties, or COP, held by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. If that sentence made you a little lightheaded, then I encourage you to back up a little bit and learn about the basics of international climate negotiations. I have some modest advice. First, pause the live stream so you keep your place and you don't have to listen to me say all that stuff I just said all over again. Second, open up a new tab and visit us online at www.eesi.org and watch the briefing from yesterday titled, What's on the Table for the Negotiations? Third, set aside an hour tomorrow at noon Eastern for our third COP29 briefing to extend the fun for another day. Fourth, while you're visiting the website, sign up for COP Dispatch to help you keep track of the negotiations from a U.S. policymaker's perspective. And if you're a congressional staff person, a good fifth step would be to reach out to me or my colleague, Anna McGinn, if you have any questions. This year, the UN climate negotiations will take place in Baku, Azerbaijan. This will be the 29th COP, so COP29. And our congressional education programming is specifically designed to inform everyone on Capitol Hill and guide policymakers on how to engage with the climate summit effectively. Yesterday, like I mentioned, we convened an expert panel that previewed key issues on the overall negotiating agenda. Tomorrow, we'll be back for a look at the US-China engagement. And today, our subject is methane, which is an especially potent greenhouse gas emitted by the energy, agriculture, and waste sectors, and a topic that is expected to attract a lot of attention at COP29. The Global Methane Pledge, for example, has been signed by 155 countries, including the United States, and will help improve methane monitoring, compliance, and reduction made possible by technology innovations. If you'd like to learn more about recent advancements in methane monitoring, keep an eye out for our upcoming podcast episode with a leading atmospheric scientist and leading scientist in atmospheric chemistry who works with satellite instruments to track emission levels. That will come out in Climate Change Solutions or around the time Climate Change Solutions comes out on November 5th. If you signed up for one of our COP29 briefings, we'll make sure you receive links and summary notes for the entire series to help you prepare for the negotiations and answer tough questions from your boss about what is happening in Baku and why it matters to people back in your states and districts here in the US. We have a survey. We'll put that slide up. We'll put it up at the end of the briefing as well. If you like what you hear, if you have any problems with today's briefing, take a moment and fill out our survey. It means a lot to us when you do. We read every response, and it only takes a minute or two to do that. Somewhere there's the slide. We'll come back to it at the end, I promise. We have 4 remarkable panelists. We'll also have some time for Q&A today. If you have a question, you can submit questions by emailing us, and the email address to use is ask, that's ASK, at eesi.org. You can also tweet us at EESI Online. Be sure to follow us on social media today at EESI Online. We're going to be doing real-time coverage on X as well as our Instagram story. So on with the show. We have, like I said, 4 amazing presenters. First up is Marcelo Mena. Marcelo is CEO of the Global Methane Hub and the former Minister of Environment for Chile. Marcelo, thank you so much for joining us today at our briefing. I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, just to start out, I'm gonna talk a little bit about this emergency brake solution that we have at hand. Next slide. And so basically, just tell you a little bit about the hub. The hub is a philanthropic effort that actually is supporting the Global Methane Pledge, and we're helping and working with countries that want to lead on this, and we actually are working on this, what we believe to be the fastest way to reduce temperature in the short term. That's why we talk about an emergency brake, in the sense that we're nearing the 1.5-degree target. There's tipping points that we want to avoid, and if we want to reduce temperature in the short term, this is the most effective way to do it. Next slide. There's many ways to dice and slice it, but what we have today is that 40% of all methane emissions come from fossil fuel extraction. There's studies that show that there's increasing concentrations of methane attributed to biogenic sources recently with higher temperature, but this is the latest global estimation that we have. And the next slide, we can see on the other side, it's not only about for the energy sector. In the next slide, we'll see that 60% is actually from food production and food waste. There's a recent study that from BRIEFED that indicated, for example, that 14% of all methane emissions in the US are associated to food waste, not only because of the production loss, the production of that food, but also the decomposition in the landfills. So we have a lot of momentum, because not only the Global Methane Pledge having 158 countries that have joined it, but also the biggest emitter, China, also committing to work with the US on mitigating methane. And so there was a summit in COP28 that was associated to this, which really unlocked a global consensus that countries should include all greenhouse gases in their new NDCs. And we hope this is something that comes to life this next process. The next slide. And there's also things that have come up that make it a new era of accountability. We have Methane Sat being launched in March, which will cover aerial emissions, basin level emissions for energy sector, but also for potentially for agricultural sector. And on the other hand, we have a point source monitor in the Tanager 1 satellite from Carbon Mapper, which will allow facility level leakage detection. I'll show you a little bit how that will also continue to drive change. Next slide. And so I'll just give you one example. A couple of years ago, we saw from satellites that big landfills are major contributors to pollution. This is the biggest pollution source today that we still could track from space. The Buenos Aires landfill, the decomposition of the organic waste causes this. And the thing is, we could plug it and look at it and reduce those emissions. The next slide will show an example that, well, first off, this is really big emissions, right? 1.4 million cars equivalent. In the long term, it's around 4 million cars equivalent in the short term. So if we're talking about mayors wanting to reduce the footprint of their city, this is a pretty low-hanging fruit, because they don't choose what people drive, but they sure do help choose what to do with the waste. Next slide. And so the case I like to always point out to is the Sunshine Canyon landfill in Los Angeles that had a whole bunch of complaints from neighbors and high emissions. This, as a former authority of environment, would have been great to have where I was, because you could see where leaks are going. You could see potentially where the bad odors are going. And the fact is, the interventions that happened after this information was available, next slide, were able to shut down those emissions significantly with very basic operations. This is not only capturing the gas to use it for energy. This is actually just good practice of covering the trash every day. Very basic things. And recent studies have shown that there's a high variability of those emissions. There's no prediction of how much waste you're managing with the emissions. There's mismanaged landfills that we need to look into. And that's why, next slide, it's really interesting what could be done and what the EPA could achieve. And the rule that's being discussed will really grow to great lengths in reducing emissions, and will be a very positive signal for other countries that have similar challenges to replicate. Next slide. And the other thing that we've been able to see with this information is that real world emissions of methane are higher than self-reported by the oil and gas sector, by the coal sector, and this may shift some of the discussions. Unchecked, these emissions could be worse than coal. We're not saying coal is good. What we're saying is we need to reduce these methane emissions. Next slide. And you can see here, for example, some of the work that groups like EDF and CATF and Methane Partners Campaign have been able to do, in which you could reveal these otherwise invisible leaks and show the exposure that some communities may have on the oil and gas extraction operations. Next slide. So making this visible allows us to take action. The IMEO, the International Methane Emissions Observatory, has been set up by UN Environment. We've been supporting it. And this allows us to really look into to those emissions and actually look at the leak, connect with the company, and actually have those leaks be addressed. This is something that the International Methane Emissions Observatory is doing. Next slide. And so this has really caused a lot of change. One thing I wanted to point out, the EU has established an import standard to only be accessed, the LNG for LNG market, that could only be accessed by lower emissions sources. This has sent a signal to other providers. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Argentina, and others are looking into plugging those leaks and having standards so they could access this. This is a really novel way to drive change that I think we should be looking out for. Next slide. Because if we put together all those commitments, we need to have around 75% mitigation of the oil and gas sector to be aligned with a 1.5-degree target. We require the oil and gas sector to take the load of methane mitigation this decade as we build solutions for other sectors. We're 70% there with the pledges and the policies that are in place. We need to make sure that these pledges and policies are real, but we could, if we expand the EU import standard focus, which the U.S., Canada, Australia, and the U.S. support. If we expand this, we could have a real chunk of the emissions be addressed, because a lot of the emissions that countries have are actually imported through the oil and gas extraction sources that they get. Next slide. And so finally, just want to say that, because I need to talk about the fact that this is the cow in the room, the elephant in the room. Anthropogenic sources of methane from livestock are important. We're doing major research efforts to reduce and crack the system to be able to reduce emissions. Next slide. There's a lot of win-wins that we could show. And the fact, if we are able to feed animals better, if we're able to provide, we could reduce emissions significantly and actually provide more income for farmers. This is something in the realm of mitigation through development. Next slide. But the last thing that we're doing is this enteric fermentation accelerator. We've deployed roughly $80 to $90 million already on R&D funding, directly or aligned, to have solutions like this. This is a can of condensed milk that uses a feed additive that reduces emissions 30% already. This is something that's not rocket science. This is not something that's going to happen in the future. Technologies are at hand. So I don't think mitigating the agricultural sector is taboo. 1 cent of a dollar per liter for 30% mitigation. I pay double for almond milk, and I don't even like. So maybe we'll try to fix the milk system with lower emissions and hopefully have a solution for every one of the sectors. That's my presentation, Daniel. Thanks so much.
Great presentation. Thank you very much. I love this briefing series. Coptober is a great time of year. This briefing in particular has been very hard on me because it's been the urge to talk about animal emissions is just very, as someone with that type of sense of humor. But I'm glad that we had you on the panel because you more responsibly addressed the topic than I ever could. So thank you, Marcelo, for doing that excellently. Next up, we have Jonathan Banks. Jonathan is the Global Director of Methane Pollution Global Director for Methane Pollution Prevention at the Clean Air Task Force. Jonathan, thank you so much for being on our briefing today. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And as a former congressional staffer who used to sit in these briefings back when they were only in person, it's really exciting to be on the other end of this as well. I'm going to do a little bit of a backwards look here, a little history lesson, and then I'm going to spring forward to what we can expect to see at COP29. Marcelo mentioned the Global Methane Pledge and the real excitement that is around that pledge and driving political action and facilitating the implementing policies that are necessary at the country level. If you go back in time to around the year 2000, That was when the science of methane really first emerged. Before that, we really didn't talk about methane as a climate pollutant at all. In the time from that first study that emerged in 2000 to the COP in Glasgow, where we launched the Global Methane Pledge, we've seen a huge acceleration in the attention for methane at a very high political level, as well as at the level of countries taking action. The source of the pledge, though, actually originated from something that the US, Canada, and Mexico did back in 2016, which was the North American Leaders Summit, where the three countries pledged to reduce oil and gas methane emissions by 45%. The difference that those pledges there made in the actions that those three countries were taking was huge. We went from seeing almost no action in the three countries on methane to a really accelerated track of federal actions in all three countries. And so the pledge grew out of that space to really drive the political spectrum to engage on methane and bring together countries in this common effort to try to bend the curve on climate change in our lifetimes, which is the promise of methane, as Marcelo was pointing out. Since that time, since the launch of the pledge in Glasgow, we've seen just huge progress with millions and millions of dollars coming into this space to support action. We've seen the launch of the Global Methane Hub, the philanthropic source for a lot of support around the world to drive methane action. And we've seen a ton of new initiatives that bring together civil society, academia, countries and companies to really drive action. And we've seen the launch of two brand new satellites completely dedicated to monitoring and reporting on methane emissions. The difference is monumental. Having worked on this issue for a really long time, I honestly never expected us to get to this point. But all of that is really just good stuff. And now we have to turn it into action, because none of this really matters if we're not actually reducing methane emissions. But there is a lot to talk about there. Just recently, earlier this year, the European Union's regulations that Marcelo mentioned went into effect. We have new US regulations for oil and gas that are in effect now, including a methane fee, which is the first of its kind in the world. Canada has just released new federal regulations that will seek to get a 75% reduction from the oil and gas sector. We've got new regs in Colombia, Nigeria. We've got regulatory development in Ecuador, Argentina, and Brazil. And at COP29, we're expecting a number of key countries, especially in Central Asia, that are going to be making announcements of new regulatory policies as well. And to support all of this, we've seen new efforts such as the Climate and Clean Air Coalition's new initiative launched the Fossil Fuel Regulatory Program, which is designed to support countries in the development of regulatory policies in the oil and gas space. And in the agriculture sector, as Marcelo mentioned, there's a ton of research going on here, but there's also starting to be a ton of action as well. When we first started working on methane, ag methane was the third rail of this little issue. I mean, no one wanted to even talk about it because the politics were so bad around it. I think the biggest change that's happened in the last few years is we've gone from worrying about the politics of agriculture methane to actually thinking about, okay, wait, there's some real solutions that have win-wins for everyone, and we can actually start reducing methane emissions now while we develop these more advanced technologies and practices that can reduce emissions in the future. At this COP, the COP presidency's already announced a climate initiative for farmers that is bringing together a whole bunch of different coalitions to foster collaboration around food and agriculture in general, but including how to reduce the climate impact and the methane impact of agriculture. We're also seeing the launch of the Climate Finance Action Fund initiative, which is designed to get a lot more money flowing out to countries to work on improving their climate emissions from agriculture. And then there's a fund for agriculture development and reducing agriculture methane program, the RAMP program, which is launched at COP28, but is also starting to get a lot more money flowing out, and we'll see more emphasis on agriculture in the NDCs as those start to flow in. On the waste sector, this COP presidency's also announced a new initiative called the Methane Reduction from Organic Waste Declaration. Tom will probably talk a little bit more about organic waste, but if you want to reduce methane in the waste sector, you kind of have to stop fueling the landfills, which you fuel the landfills by sending your apple core to the landfill. The waste reduction, the methane reduction from organic waste declaration is really designed to bring focus to that. We're also expecting to see a lot more announcements on food loss and waste as we get closer to the UN's 2030 goal of cutting in half the per capita food waste that consumers and retailers produce. And then also launched back at COP28, we're expecting to see a lot more on the Lowering Organic Waste Methane Initiative, which is known as LOW-M. We're expecting to see a number of new financial announcements, as well as some new partner countries, likely some very big names that will be announced at COP28. And then related, and I think Tom will talk about this more, we've got the US landfill gas standard that has been announced as being updated, and we're hoping to hear an update on that in Baku. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Dan.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan, for that. You made the transition from congressional staff audience member to EESI panelist perfectly seamlessly. So great presentation. As a reminder, after our fourth presenter today, we will have some time for Q&A. If you'd like to send us a question, you can email us at ask, that's ASK, at eesi.org. And you can also follow us on social media at EESI Online. We're active on X and on our Instagram story today, so you can get us questions that way as well. Next up, we will hear from Tom Frankiewicz, subject matter expert on waste sector methane at RMI. Tom, it is great to see you again today. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, great to be here, Dan. And also thank you to Marcelo and Jonathan for teeing things up nicely. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper, both on the technology and on the waste sector specifically. Next. So emissions visibility is rapidly improving. There's a broad ecosystem of technologies and tools that can detect, pinpoint, and quantify methane emissions, making what was once invisible visible. From fixed sensors to drones to airplanes, we can now monitor methane emissions at different temporal and spatial scales. I'm also very excited about the launch of 2 new methane detecting satellites this year, Carbon Mapper's Tanager 1 and EDF's Methane Stat, which together give us a much better sense of where methane pollution is coming from, how it changes over time with more observations, and what we can do about it. But policymakers play a really critical role in turning methane emissions data into action. EPA's new super emitter program for the oil and gas sector is one example of how you could take this advanced monitoring information and inform more timely mitigation on the ground, ensuring that the largest leaks are more quickly addressed. And there's plenty of opportunity to integrate these data to improve the accuracy of greenhouse gas inventories, reduce methane emissions from landfills, or calculate methane leakage associated with fuel production. However, there's also a need for funding from Congress to procure methane emissions data to make all of this possible. Next. On that end, I want to take a moment to acknowledge progress that the U.S. has made in addressing methane pollution, spurred in part by the Inflation Reduction Act and also the bipartisan infrastructure law. At last year's COP, EPA released final rules to reduce methane pollution from the oil and gas sector. And over the past year, they've been cooperating with DOE to implement the IRA's methane emission reduction program. which includes improvements to the greenhouse gas reporting, financial and technical assistance for states and operators, and a common sense charge on wasteful emissions. In the waste sector, the White House released a national strategy on food waste loss and to boost organics recycling. And EPA has provided funding to state, tribal, and local governments to reduce waste sector methane through programs like the Solid Waste Infrastructure for Recycling, or SWIFR grants program, as well as the Climate Pollution Reduction grants. But of course, there's more that can be done to get a handle on methane pollution and achieve the objectives of the Global Methane Pledge. In the waste sector, and specifically, there's a critical opportunity to strengthen federal landfill standards and boost organics diversion, which I'll be discussing in the following few slides. Next. So there's a significant opportunity to reduce methane from the waste sector. Jonathan already mentioned that you have to both control the emissions at the landfill and also kind of take away the fuel, which is really organic matter going to the landfill. So what's causing those methane emissions is it's the organic waste, and that's food waste, but also yard clippings, paper, cardboard, things like that, that begin to break down in the absence of oxygen once they're in the landfill. Most modern sanitary landfills are designed to capture their gas through a system of pipes, wellheads, and blowers, working in tandem with the landfill cover. But even landfills with a gas collection system don't capture all the methane. All told, municipal landfills are the third largest source of methane in the US, emitting an estimated 3.6 million tons in 2022, according to EPA. But as advances in technology and remote sensing surveys have shown, they're likely higher. But also the solutions are quite clear. You have to keep organic waste out of the landfill to avoid future methane generation, and we have to improve gas collection controls for the waste that's already buried that would otherwise continue emitting for decades. So it's really important that we lean in on both solutions together. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, prevention. Prevention keeps the organic waste out of the landfills in the first place. And we could do this by reducing the waste at the source, donating surplus food, and recycling what's left into compost. This food waste scale that EPA put out this past year, I think demonstrates the value of food waste recovery and commensurate methane reductions than the more conventional waste hierarchy. As you move from the right to the left, you move from post-consumer food waste disposal to food loss prevention and avoidance, which essentially prioritizes feeding people and nutrient recovery as you reduce methane. Next slide. So with respect to mitigation strategies optimize landfill design, monitoring, and operations to increase methane capture and reduce fugitive methane emissions. I'd like to point out a few key features from this site that we see as essential to working together to create a data-informed or smart landfill that finds and fixes leaks more quickly and controls landfill gas more effectively. It's a little hard to point out on this, but you see these kind of little red pipes towards the top. This is an existing gas collection system that has been retrofitted with automated well tuning, which can increase gas collection recovery up to 20%. And you also see a satellite floating overhead and drones and these little devices that are fixed to the cover. This is a network of fixed sensors, near aerial observations or drones, and satellites working in tandem to find and fix leaks more quickly. Next. Back in August, I had the privilege of visiting a landfill in Orange County, California, that is doing both of these things. They have a composting program to keep organic waste out of the landfill. And at the same time, they're exploring technologies to improve methane capture using a network of drones and advanced gas collection to minimize fugitive emissions. They're even trying out a methane sensing robotic dog. So clearly all options are on the table. Next. The benefits of taking action are clear and have a global and local impact. While tackling waste sector methane emissions keeps planet heating gases out of the atmosphere and reduces global warming, the benefits to the community are significant. It improves local air quality, protects public health, and investing in local food systems helps farmers and keeps soils healthy. And it also creates jobs as part of a more circular economy. But additional federal action is needed to ensure methane reductions are achieved at scale, advance our climate targets, and protect communities nationwide. We're really excited by the work that EPA is already doing to update its Clean Air Act standards for landfills. It's important to raise the bar for all landfills and set standards that reflect the latest best practices in methane monitoring and control that panelists have already talked about. These technologies are being used, they're available, and we need to incorporate them so that they can level the playing field for all landfills. Congress can also provide additional support to catalyze landfill methane reductions. Additional grant programs could support state and local waste prevention programs, organics recycling infrastructure, and improved landfill methane capture. Next. So in closing, I want to talk about emissions transparency. This is critical for identifying and prioritizing emission sources, informing decision makers on the benefits of investing in methane reduction interventions. And that's why that's what WasteMap, the Waste Methane Assessment Platform, does. This was something developed by RMI in partnership with Clean Air Task Force and with generous support from the Global Methane Hub and global.org. The platform brings together modeled and monitored emissions data from our partners at Carbon Mapper and SRON at the site, city, and national levels in a map identifying the world's disposal sites and includes a decision support tool that helps prioritize investments in methane mitigation. WasteMap supports jurisdictions in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, and supports regional initiatives like LOW that Jonathan mentioned to help decision makers develop better baselines, estimate potential emission reductions, and ultimately create a pathway to MRV, or measurement, reporting, and verification, to help reconcile those top-down and bottom-up numbers so that we could catalyze investments in the waste sector. With that, I thank you and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Tom. That was a great presentation. As a reminder for our audience, if you'd like to go back and rewatch any of the presentations or review the slides or presentation materials, everything can be found at www.eesi.org. If you go to the briefing page for this briefing, that would be one way to find it. You can also go to the briefing series page, since this is a three-part briefing series about what Congress needs to know about COP29. Next up is Dr. Ilissa Ocko. Ilissa is a senior advisor in the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate at the U.S. Department of State. Ilissa, thank you very much. This is a busy time for you, as it is for everyone. We really appreciate you and all of our panelists making time during these critical weeks before COP29 to join us for our briefing today.
Thank you so much to EESI for organizing this briefing and for inviting the Department of State to participate. Quick apology to everyone for the state of my voice. It is not normally like this, but I will carry on. Next slide, please. The Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, which is also known as SPEC, has made methane mitigation a priority since its inception for three key reasons. First, a large fraction of today's warming is from methane emissions from human activities. And because methane has a relatively short atmospheric lifetime, as opposed to carbon dioxide, the moment we start reducing methane emissions, we can almost immediately reduce its large warming impact. And this is why reducing methane emissions is considered the fastest way to curb the climate crisis. Second, as you've already heard, we have technologies and strategies available right now to cut methane emissions from human activities. And assessments show that we could actually deploy all of these technologies to reduce emissions by half, many of which are largely affordable. And finally, the State Department's global reach through bilateral relationships and embassies across the globe, along with close coordination with other domestic agencies working on methane mitigation, makes it well positioned to help reduce methane emissions globally. Next slide, please. So our team's scope of work is quite broad, but it covers pledges to plans to progress. So you've already heard a lot about the Global Methane Pledge. The US and the European Union launched the Global Methane Pledge in 2021, which now has more than 155 country participants that are responsible for around half of current emissions. And these countries are committed to the global goal of cutting human emitted methane 30% by 2030. This pledge really put methane front and center on the global climate policy agenda, and we've seen significant progress since then to deliver robust country and company commitments and to mobilize finance so that we can implement these strategies. We also, and this includes methane action plans. So more than 90 countries have now released or are developing methane action plans, most of which have been supported by our close partner, the United Nations Environment Program Climate and Clean Air Coalition, through their Methane Roadmap Action Program that helps countries develop implementable plans alongside a continual stepwise strengthening process. And our office also helps secure progress. We work across all sectors and with major emitters to implement projects and strengthen policies while facilitating data tools and mobilizing funding, and with many agency and international partners. Next slide, please. So we're working to drive methane reduction solutions globally in all sectors, and particularly in the energy sector, which you've heard has the cheapest reductions and a significant economic and energy security benefits. And so we are leveraging domestic oil and gas methane regulatory action to enhance ambition abroad. We're focused on engaging the largest oil and gas methane emitters to develop reduction projects and strengthen policies and regulations. And we also help mobilize technical assistance and project development support from 9 US agencies, such as the EPA, DOE, and Department of Transportation, as well as various international partners. For the agriculture sector, we work with US agencies such as USDA and USAID and international partners such as the Global Methane Hub to support research and development and to also support developing countries and farmers with strategies to increase productivity while decreasing methane emissions. For the waste sector, we work with agency partners such as USAID and international partners such as the World Bank to reduce emissions across the food chain from upstream operations to divert organic waste from even getting to the landfill, and then also all the way to strengthening landfill regulations. Next slide, please. We also work bilaterally with major emitters, including China. Last year, in the Sunnyland statement released by the US and China, China committed for the first time to include all greenhouse gases in their next Paris Agreement target. This then significantly contributed to the breakthrough global stocktake consensus call at COP28, which Marcelo mentioned earlier, for countries to deliver 2035 nationally determined contributions that are economy-wide, 1.5C aligned, and cover all greenhouse gases. We are also seeing strong progress in Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan after joining the Global Methane Pledge last year. Brazil is also in the process of developing their own oil and gas methane regulations after we secured their commitment to do so at COP28, COP last year. Next slide, please. We heard a lot about data tools from Frank, and an example of a data tool that we are very involved with is the United Nations Environment Program International Methane Emissions Observatory Methane Alert and Response System. MARS is a tool that uses public satellite data to detect large emissions of methane across the globe, such as natural gas leaks from pipelines, and then notifies countries so that actions can be taken to reduce emissions. It essentially makes the invisible visible, telling governments and operators where to look for the methane. And so we've helped MARS secure pathways for notifying countries that represent more than 2/3 of detected events. Next slide, please. So last year, the US and partners delivered over $1 billion in grant funding to achieve President Biden's methane finance sprint, including $255 million for the World Bank Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership to cut oil and gas sector methane. Next slide, please. This is just an example of many of the partners that we work with domestically in the US government and also internationally, but we also work with NGOs, philanthropies, the private sector, universities, and other stakeholders. All the other speakers on this during this briefing are people that we work closely with and organizations we work closely with. Next slide, please. The next major milestone for our team is COP29 coming up in a few weeks in Baku. Key events that we are planning are the second Methane and Non-CO2 Greenhouse Gases Summit, hosted by US, China, and this year also by the COP29 presidency of Azerbaijan, as well as the Global Methane Pledge Ministerial. Both events will feature announcements on new efforts across the globe to strengthen methane mitigation, such as related to policies, plans, and finance, and specifically waste methane, which is a priority topic at this year's COP. Next slide, please. Another upcoming milestone for our team is the next round of NDCs due in February. We are actively working with countries to ensure that NDCs include strong measures to reduce methane emissions, as was decided at last COPs in the global stocktake, and that the top line emissions reduction target includes methane. Next slide, please. So I just want to close by reiterating why methane mitigation is a must. First, it is possible, as there are numerous strategies available to slash methane emissions, many of which you already heard about today. Second, it is practical, as there are many cost-effective opportunities to cut emissions with co-benefits like energy security. And finally, it is powerful. It is the fastest way to slow down warming during our lifetimes, which, for example, is crucial for reducing risks of extreme weather events. And because methane also leads to the formation of toxic ground level ozone, it also has massive benefits to public health and food security. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilissa. I thought your voice sounded great. So thank you very much for that great presentation. Before we get to Q&A, we love working with the folks at State. And yesterday, I just wanted to give him a quick plug. Andrew Rakestraw was part of our briefing yesterday. He's the Deputy U.S. Head of Delegation to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement negotiations. So if you want to learn a little bit more about higher level U.S. priorities and the approach that the official delegation is taking with COP29, Andrew's presentation was a great source of that. So I would encourage everyone to check that out for sure. We had all of our panelists were great yesterday, but special shout out to Andrew. All right, so that brings us to Q&A. There is still time for submitting questions from our online audience. And they're coming in, which is great. Thank you for that. If you would like to send us a question, you can email us at ask, that's ASK, at eesi.org. But to get us started, I would like to revisit something that, Ilissa, you were just speaking with, and maybe we could go back to Marcelo at the top of the order and then give everyone a chance to comment on this. And the question is, do all countries make commitments around methane emissions reductions in their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs? And what kinds of conversations are happening with the February 10th deadline coming up for the new NDCs? What kind of conversations are happening around methane as countries are thinking about how they want to approach that deadline? Marcelo, start with you.
Yeah, great. So the Methane Pledge is a global commitment to reduce emissions 30% by 2030. If we do that and continue to do the 45% mitigation, this will help shave off around 0.2 degrees. We need to do it. If we want to keep 1.5 alive, we have to have methane mitigation. So we're working with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, who's helping many countries include methane in their targets and have methane action plans, around 40 of them already. And we are also happy to see the progress that China will likely to continue to have. They published a methane action plan right before the Sunnyland statement, and we hope that they also include that. So I would say the type of things that were happening, the low-hanging fruit, there's likely going to be a lot of commitments on landfills. Like a couple of weeks ago, the Latin American Ministry Forum said that they will work on methane emissions in landfills. And it's very likely that there's some push of having sectoral targets on that. It seems to be a low-hanging fruit, especially because there's two types of countries: those that produce a lot of oil and gas, in which you have to have a lot of reductions, and those that don't have a lot of oil and gas, in which it's more difficult because you have waste and agriculture. So we hope some progress there. And so we're having multiple conversations. The Brazilian presidency also wants, for COP30, wants it to be a good COP with ambition. we have to understand that the integrity, the momentum of the Paris Agreement is at stake, but the methane mitigation agenda is a easy thing because many countries have not looked into these mitigation. I'll just give you one final example. The Chilean NDC, which I know quite well, has maybe one measure that talks about methane. I could think of hundreds now. So there's many things that we could include this time around. We just didn't last process. So hopefully this time we'll get many more.
Jonathan, I'll turn it over to you next for hear what you have to say.
Yeah, just a couple of things to maybe add to that. I mean, I think, like all things methane, we're starting to see a real change in momentum around this, and more countries including methane in the mix of their NDC with specific policy call-outs, sometimes specific target call-outs within the NDC. It's important to remember that every country does their NDC in a slightly different way and has different kind of rules around how it has to be put together. And so there's often restrictions within a country on how an NDC can be put together. But in general, the more we can see a call out for methane in these NDCs, the better off we're going to be. I think it's also important to note that an NDC is, the first kind of baby step towards action. It's an extremely important piece, but if that NDC isn't translated into implemented policy in a country, it really doesn't mean anything. And so we have to see not only the NDCs adopting this and creating that space for policies, but we also have to see those implementing policies being brought forward in countries to drive those emission reductions down.
Tom, over to you. What are you hearing, or what are you tracking in terms of how methane may or may not become part of the next round of NDCs for different countries?
Well, we're not really in the weeds on kind of NDC development, and so maybe I'll just take a step back from that, having been I guess on the inside on NDC development over years. One of the things that's really critical to getting to a place where methane or other non-CO2 pollutants are sufficiently prioritized is having sufficient, having informed inventories and sufficient information that really shows their impact. Because not only when you equalize everything, if you normalize everything to CO2 equivalents, does methane writ large, but especially waste, fall pretty low on the list. But if anything, advances in monitoring technology and remote sensing has shown us that even those inventories themselves are quite undervalued. So I'll just reiterate the importance of actually having an important baseline to work off of to even start talking about carve-outs in the NDC.
And Ilissa, you mentioned the NDCs in your original presentation, but if you have anything else you'd like to add, please feel free.
Yeah, I just want to make two key points, and I want to make them really clear. And so the first is that it is important to include methane and other non-CO2 greenhouse gases in top-line targets. If we don't do that and only have targets for CO2, we miss a major opportunity to avoid additional warming. And while most NDCs already include all and cover all greenhouse gases, some of the major emitters do not. So we need them to do that. Second, we need to have ambitious methane action aligned with a 1.5C pathway in the NDCs. And this is crucial because we can have the same NDC target include different levels of methane ambition and have vastly different climate outcomes. And the bottom line is that the more ambitious our methane actions, the more climate benefits we will have both during our lifetimes and for generations to come.
Thanks very much for that. This one comes to us from our online audience. Hasn't been mentioned yet. I thought it was kind of interesting, so I'll toss it out there. And if anyone has something to say, please feel free to weigh in. The question has to do with aquatic methane. And the person who wrote the question talks about dam reservoirs and man-made lagoons and suggests that aquatic methane has flown under the radar. And the question is anyone aware of any regulations or proposals or programs or anything like that that are in the works or proposals that might be discussed in Baku related or that would be intended to address aquatic methane?
I'm happy to start. Marcelo, go ahead.
Okay, so we're working with a group called Blue Methane, in which we're doing research on that, helping them fund research on that, given the fact that the decomposition, the accumulation of for example, in dams and reservoirs, show that there's some emissions. The reality is there's probably going to be a confounding signal, in the sense that biogenic emissions have a chemical signal that are, that's similar, whether it's a landfill, whether it's a cow burp, or whether it's a wetland, and so therefore I am, and we also think that 40% of methane emissions are non-anthropogenic. I'm not really sure how clear-cut that non-anthropogenic angle is, in the sense that, first off, higher temperatures increase biogenic activity. Second off, a lot of the organic waste that we put in streams is causing this rising. Without organic waste, higher temperature, we wouldn't have higher emissions, and so therefore we need to be looking into it. But it's a very difficult thing, because as inventories start getting more sophisticated and considering more things, we start actually realizing that there's more to it. Aquaculture, for example, some say is a significant source of methane. Whether it's a wetland or whether it's a rice paddy, it's very difficult for us to really distinguish which one is which. So I think we need to be looking into more, but we know damn well where all those point sources are from the oil and gas sector, and we better shut those down fast before we lose time.
Jonathan, if you have anything you'd like to add, please feel free. And Tom and Ilissa, same goes for you. But I know, Jonathan, you had some.
Yeah, I mean, it is, as the person who asked the question mentioned, it is a very overlooked area. It popped up in a paper recently on the greenhouse gas inventories as a big contributor and an overlooked contributor in the methane space. There's some very little research that's been going into this. There was some really good stuff done in Brazil years ago about looking at how you could deal with this from a technological solution perspective. And if you basically think about a fish tank aerator, that's what we're talking about in many cases. But I think the real issue is, or one of the real interesting issues here, is the potential connection to another pollutant that we aren't talking about today, but it's N2O, nitrogen, and the runoff that also could be fueling methane coming out of freshwater lakes as well. And so there's an interesting connection between some of the nascent efforts on N2O and this methane issue, but there's a lot of work. The initial work that needs to go into this is a lot more research and understanding of the true magnitude and the source of the problem.
And I'll just add that there's a growing body of researchers that are working on methane removal strategies. And there was a recent publication by the National Academy of Sciences that kind of outlines a research agenda in this space. And that is one of the targets for trying to develop these strategies to, let's say, capture the methane, for example, is from some of these other natural systems that now human influence is also in many ways speeding up. And it's also another motivation to reduce all the methane we possibly can with the existing strategies that we have, because the warmer the planet, the more we are potentially speeding up biogeochemical cycles in wetlands, for example, and the more methane that could be emitted. So it's just another reason to keep temperatures as low as possible. And methane is one of the best levers we have to slow down warming as soon as possible.
And it's also a good flag. That question was a good flag for us. Of course, we'll have lots of methane coverage in our daily COP Dispatch newsletter, but now I think we'll know to look out for any announcements around aquatic methane to help maybe overcome the fact that it's been flying under the radar a little bit. So thanks for that. That was great. We're getting close to time. And so I was thinking about maybe asking a wrap-up question. And Jonathan, we can start with you if you'd like, but the sectors that we've talked about energy, agriculture, and industry, energy, agriculture, and waste. And I'm curious, those are industrial sectors. and there's lots of private sector entities engaged in all of those different places. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how different private entities in those sectors are engaged in setting these commitments or making these commitments, and if there are, if you have a suggestion or an example or two of a particularly impactful partnership between the public and the private sector. So, Jonathan, I can start with you, and then we'll go through the loop, and I think we'll end up with Marcelo having the last word today, unless Ilissa wants it. She can have it if she wants it.
Sure, and I'm going to be nice to Tom, and I'll take energy and let him stick with waste. On the energy side of things, I think there are a number of interesting partnerships between the companies, civil society, and international government organizations. There is an initiative known as the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, which is companies and civil society and then academia and others engaged in trying to provide greater clarity around emissions from the oil and gas sector, as well as direction on mitigation and reduction of emissions. It's been quite active for a number of years. It's now in what they call OGMP 2.0. With the idea of really driving a much greater understanding of emissions and emissions reductions. It's actually been somewhat adopted into the new European regulations on oil and gas methane. There's a number of other oil and gas initiatives that folks could look out for with a bunch of other acronyms. There's the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. There's the Methane Guiding Principles. There's other initiatives such as the International Methane Emissions Observatory, which includes a number of folks working in that space as well, and a whole bunch of other things. There's quite a plethora there.
Great, thanks. And Tom, you've been teed up to talk about waste, so I'll turn it over to you.
Always happy to. When it comes to waste, partnership is critical, but I think it looks a little bit different. Where in the oil and gas sector, you might have major national oil companies and obviously the private sector. And waste, even though commitments and inventories are rolled up nationally, the responsibility is really at the state and local level. And so it's important to really mobilize and support jurisdictions. So there's LOW has already been mentioned twice. That's an example. Another is the Subnational Methane Action Coalition that brings together cities throughout the world. And the reason for that is not only is the responsibility with them, but it's really critical to provide emissions transparency, technical support, and to catalyze finance and bring in the private sector where there are private services. So that's critical in the US, where not all municipalities have the same resources, and even more so in the global South, where you have major mega cities that have huge waste issues and methane emissions, but don't have access to capital and the same technical resources that other cities do. So it's really important to work with those jurisdictions in partnership to make sure that they can improve their waste management systems in a way that helps their countries meet their global methane commitments.
Thanks. Tom, quick follow-up. I assume also that the monitoring is a lot weaker in the Southern Hemisphere and in developing countries. Is that also true? Is that also an impediment that would have to be overcome if we're going to move ahead there?
Absolutely. I mean, inventory, even things like having a waste characterization to know how much waste and what kind is going to your dump site. That's a challenge. Satellites certainly help with that, but they can't solve it all. So it's really important to match up those satellite observations with conditions on the ground. And I think that's where jurisdictions working together to share resources and bring greater emissions transparency are critical.
Great, thanks. Marcelo, I'll go to you next. Examples from your work around where the public and the private sectors are either working together on commitments or partnerships on implementation.
Yeah, I'd say the Enteric Fermentation Accelerator is a really great example. We have the private sector investing, the philanthropic sector investing, and also governments funding directly or aligned. So the USDA works with us, but also the governments of New Zealand and Ireland. So it's very interesting because we need to have breakthroughs and we need to lower the cost of mitigation in the sector. And I'd say a great one also is the Dairy Methane Action Alliance, which is EDF launched by EDF, Danone, Nestle, Mars, and Starbucks are there working to reduce methane emissions. I think it's a really great dynamic because it could, we got maybe 30 to 40% of all the consumption and production on dairy saying, you know what, guys, in the government, it's okay. We could talk about mitigation and it's not, going to break the bank. It's actually pretty good. Makes a lot of sense. And so at 1 cent of a dollar, as I was saying, per liter, way less than anybody probably had in their mind, it's doable, it's achievable, and we need to reduce those costs, and it needs to be working together with the private sector.
Thanks. And we shuffled things around a little bit, Ilissa, to give you and the State Department the last word on our panel today.
Appreciate it. And I'll start off by just broadening the question you just asked to partnerships in general. All of the work that has been discussed today, which is so many different projects, I can't even keep track of them all, has all been made possible by various combinations of partnership. And my example is this briefing. It's not a coincidence that there is so much overlap across all of the speakers' remarks today. And it's because we all work closely together on this issue. And this is because there is a clear consensus that methane mitigation is possible, practical, and powerful. And we have made tremendous progress in the past several years, both domestically and globally, to scale up existing strategies to slash emissions. But there is much more to be done. We need to ramp up ambition and accelerate actions. But I am optimistic that we can get it done, in large part because of this growing community of governments, companies, organizations, and researchers that are increasingly committed to tackling methane.
Thank you very much. I think much more to be done would be like the motto of our briefing series around COP29. That sentiment certainly comes up quite a lot. Thank you, Marcelo, Jonathan, Tom, and Ilissa for being amazing panelists today. I like all of our panels, but like Ilissa was just saying, this group, the chemistry, pun intended, of the work that you all are doing around methane is really, really amazing, interesting. I could listen to this all day. Thank you so much for helping us with the panel today and being part of it. Really, really appreciate it. I'd also like to say thanks to my EESI colleagues who are responsible for actually doing all the hard work. Thanks to Dan-O, Omri, Allison, Anna, Molly, and Nicole. We have 3 tremendous interns who are helping us as well, Jemiah, Josh, and Alia. In the background is lurking Troy. And Lynn, thank you for all of your work as well. I mentioned Anna and my thank you. Anna and I will be at COP29 in Baku for both weeks. So if you're in our audience today and you would like to either meet up or have any questions, our contact information is all available on our website. You can go back and revisit any of today's briefing, yesterday's briefing, and tomorrow our extensive coverage of the UN climate negotiations continues with a briefing called US-China Engagement and International Climate Diplomacy. That is going to be an amazing briefing as well. Definitely sign up for COP Dispatch for daily updates during the negotiations. And we will put the slide up next with the link to our survey. If you have a moment and you're in our online audience today, if you have a moment to take the survey, that would be great. If you have any issues or ideas, please feel free to share them. We always read every response, and we really appreciate that. So with that, we'll conclude. I hope everyone has a great rest of your Thursday. And I hope we'll see everyone back in almost 23 hours, noon Eastern tomorrow for US-China engagement and international climate diplomacy. Thanks, everyone. Great to see you.